This is Radio 4, now at 9:05. Here's Melvyn Bragg to start the week.
Good morning. Stephen Jay Gould is Professor of Geology and Zoology at Harvard, and his latest book, Life's Grandeur, takes its title from Darwin, whose work he drives to a logical conclusion which may dismay those who think of mankind's history in any of the traditional ways. Dr. Oliver Sacks, whose books include The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, is currently roving around BBC Two in a series called The Mind Traveller, which this week visits the island of the colourblind. Susan Blackmore is a senior lecturer in psychology. Her research includes out-of-body and near-death experiences. She recently gave a talk entitled Waking from the Mean Dream. Stephen Fry, currently filming Wild, in which he plays Oscar, has brought out a third novel called Making History. And Brenda Maddox, biographer of those who have made history and columnist of The Times, joins us once again. Stephen Jay Gould, what makes you say that the idea of progress in the history of life is a fundamental fallacy?
Our culture loves it. It's one of the foremost defining points of Western culture, but there's nothing in what we understand either about evolutionary theory or the history of life that would lead us to support such a notion. Just take the theoretical point. If Darwin's theory of natural selection is the centerpiece, then natural selection only talks about adaptation to changing local environments. There's no principle of progress there. A parasite that becomes morphologically simplified to live in the body of its host, not a very pleasant lifestyle by our terms, but just as good for it as we are in our environment, is just as well adapted as we are in all our complexity. So there's no way to derive it out of theory. And then when you look at the history of life, you don't see any pattern in that direction. You see notions of mass extinction wherein 50 to 90% of species are wiped out. The only reason we're here in all our grandeur today is that luckily big bodies struck the earth 65 million years ago and wiped dinosaurs out who had dominated mammals for 100 million preceding years. What's more, this isn't the age of man, as the old biased language like to put it, or the age of insects. This is the age of bacteria. Bacteria still dominate life on Earth today as they have for 3.5 billion years. So you don't see it either in the history of life as we noted factually. You can't derive it from evolutionary theory as we understand it. It's just a myth. It's a desire. It's a hope of Western culture. It's the way we put ourselves arrogantly on top of the heap. It's the message of Psalm 8 when the psalmist says, God, how can you care for us when you've made these glorious heavens? And then the answer comes down, thou hast made them a little lower than the angels to have dominion over all things. It's our sop to our real fear and understanding that we are pretty insignificant in factual terms. That doesn't make us insignificant in ethical or moral terms, because that's how we define our own life.
So there's the natural way and then the cultural way. I'll come to it in a minute, the cultural way. But in the natural way, you say that it is beyond question that we're other than accidental latecomers, that there is no sense at all in which there has been any movement forward or upward, or any other word that you're going to stamp on, from bacteria, which some people would say are rather simple objects, to man's brain or woman's brain, which is a very complex and complicated object.
I don't deny that there are lineages in the history of life that by certain meaningful criteria, such as neurological complexity, are more complex than others. All I'm saying is that if you look at life as a whole over all lineages, there's no trend whatsoever to increase complexity. And then, of course, there's the problem of the definition of complexity. We might say we're on top because we can talk and we can be the scribe of the history of life as no other species can. So if I tell you that bacteria are predominant, you might say, how could you ever say that? Bacteria can't think about us the way we think about them. But I don't know, if I was a bacterium, I would say, yeah, but you can't live 2 miles down inside the earth in a little hole in the rock, and you can't live at 100 degrees centigrade, and you can't live in several billion per gram of soil. And so it all depends on your perspective. From a bacterial perspective, we're nothing other than a mobile island of delectable resources for their exploitation.
So language, consciousness, and imagination are just bibblers of what we've accidentally become, this little twiglet on the edge of accidental twiglet on the edge of a very, very big bush.
Fabulously interesting evolutionary invention. But I think we make a mistake if we confuse the impact of something with its inevitability. I don't deny that the human brain is the most phenomenal accidental invention that ever occurred in evolution. I don't deny that Homo sapiens has altered the surface of this planet in a geological eye blink more than any species ever has in history. But the fact that we've had this enormous and profound impact on the history of the Earth doesn't mean that we were predictably necessarily here. We can still be here accidentally and have that impact.
Is there any right? There doesn't seem to be any room whatsoever for the idea, which many people have held in many different parts of the world in many different ways, that there's a God at work.
I think that's an issue that science just can't address at all. That is to me, religion and the notion of God is a question of ethics and values. It can't be adjudicated by any statement about the factual character of the earth. We can say that if your notion of religion demands that the earth's only 10,000 years old, then you have a pretty blanket view of religion, and that's wrong. That much we can say. But I think a deeper notion of God as an ethical concept that the factual world of science can't decide.
You make a distinction in your book, as I understand it, between Darwin's natural selection over millions, billions of years, and the great speed up in this particular part, this accidental latecomer that we are, over the last 100,000, particularly, say, the last 15,000 words. And that it has a cultural direction. Instead of waiting millions of years for the wheel to be evolved and passed on, somebody invents it in 2 or 3 generations, somebody else uses it. And similarly with language and the way people wear their baseball caps and birds pecking through the top of milk bottles or whatever it is, it goes very quickly, like birds, but it goes very quickly. Now, what does that tell you?
The phenomenon is so different. I wish people wouldn't even use the word cultural evolution, because that implies there are more similarities to Darwinian evolution. To me, they're just quite different processes. After all, the people who painted the caves at Lascaux 20,000 years ago did it with the same sophistication as any great artist today, so there's been no biological change in the mind for 20,000 years. And yet, in that period, everything that we call civilization, from Jericho to London, exists, built by a mind of unchanged capacity. The speed of that is phenomenal. And the reason is that cultural change is an entirely different system, works by a different mode of inheritance. It's Lamarckian. That is, whatever we invent in one generation, we teach directly to the next. Now, as soon as biological evolution doesn't work that way. If it did, the history of biology would look different. Evolution would be more rapid. It would be more directional. As soon as you have a Lamarckian system where anything that you invent that's beneficial can be taught directly to the next generation, you have a powerful mechanism for accumulation. You teach the next generation what you've invented, and they build upon it, and everything accelerates forward at a phenomenal pace.
And what does that tell you? This is just part of the accident.
It tells me that cultural change is that with the evolution of human neurological complexity, we've unleashed on this planet an entirely different process, which is why human evolution has been so cataclysmically influential on the history of this planet.
Brenda Maddox.
Your book seems to me terribly preachy. I mean, you made me feel like a Southern Baptist fundamentalist that you were showing fossils to, saying, look, it's not the way you thought. But apart from people who are very religious and actually need to see God's plan and a design and a direction in it all, who are you shocking? I mean, how important is it to you to be a breaker of myths? I mean, who believes in all this physical, natural progress? It's quite forgetting the cultural business, which seems to be entirely separate.
See, I think if you ask most well-educated people, do you believe overtly in this form of progress, they'd say no. And yet, in 100 different ways, our language, our iconography, our modes of thinking are imbued with it in ways we don't understand. I see myself as preachy with respect to that message, but I think it's a liberating message. It's not preachy in the sense that it tells you how to live your life or what your religious attitudes ought to be. It's preachy only in the sense that I'd love for people to break out of these constraining myths about human superiority, just so that...
I mean, I regard myself as well-educated, but when you expose that myth of the maps of the age of little sea creatures growing into an age of lizards, growing into an age of man, I thought, yes, that's how I would represent it. And you absolutely exploded it, exactly.
Now, if you look at the history of painting of primitive scenes of life in chronological order, every single one of them, there have been 20 or so sequences done in coffee table books and museums since we had an adequate geological timescale in the 1850s. They're always done only to show the history of the most complex things. You get one picture of invertebrates, then you get... When fishes evolve, you never see another invertebrate again. As soon as one lineage of fishes crawls out on land, you never see another fish again. This is not the history of life. It's an oddly cobbled history of the most complex thing through time.
But surely the reason why this myth is so tenacious is because we do believe in cultural progress. We believe we have learned things that when we actually abolish, say, slavery or, God willing, capital punishment or learn a better way of teaching children, we think we have made progress. So then we extrapolate, and that myth isn't going to go away.
Yeah, no, good point. I think you're right. I think there's complex reasons why we put a myth of progress upon the history of life. I think one of them you correctly identify. I think there is, at least in technology, progress because of that Lamarckian style of inheritance. And I agree with you. We look at the undeniable fact of progress doesn't mean it's going to be good for us ultimately, but we look at the undeniable fact of technological complexification. I think you're right. We use that as a false model for the history. I think that's only one of the reasons. I think the saw-made reason is another one, but I accept what you say. And I think that's a fallacy. I think we just have to understand why biological and cultural changes are different.
What fascinated me in your book was that Darwin himself didn't believe in progress. He did not believe this natural selection led to a goal, and then you show how he appended at the very end a kind of poetic statement which said he did. Was this like Galileo saying, well, really, here's my scientific theory, but in order to get along in the society in which I live, I will say to you, well, okay, I really believe what the rest of you believe.
Although Galileo broke out of that and house arrest till his death was his reward, and he never said...
Well, Darwin had to appease his wife, who was very
He never said, pour c'est mauvais, as legend has it. But, no, I think, as I see Darwin, he's just like all great thinkers, he's complex. There are contradictions. He was a philosophical radical. And in that sense, he understood that there's no justification for progress from the theory of natural selection, and he reveled in telling that to the world. On the other hand, living as a country squire south of London, he was a social conservative. I don't mean his political attitudes, I mean his lifestyle views. And here he was, living in Victorian Britain at the height of its industrial and colonial expansion, when there never was a society in which a belief in progress was so intrinsically part of the world order, and Darwin couldn't totally abandon it. And so he smuggles progress back in, not by natural selection, which he knew would not justify it, but by an ecological argument, that there's always competition in a crowded world, and therefore the dog that's stronger and smarter will get more prey over other dogs, and that will lead to mental and physical advance.
Let's go around the table. Dr. Oliver Sacks, would you like to comment?
Yes, I'd, like everyone else, one likes to believe in progress and biological progress. But I'm very much with Stephen that Stephen has a lovely phrase he used once when he referred to man as a glorious accident, and both the feeling of glory and the feeling of accident is overwhelmingly strong. But certainly, beside my own sort of neurological half, I have a botanical half, and there I see very well that all sorts of so-called primitive plants and living fossils are beautifully adapted now and perfectly successful and just as good as anything else. And so something which fascinated me, and in my own recent travels, as being on various islands in the Pacific and seeing how on these different islands both biological evolution has proceeded in startlingly different ways and cultural changes. So I've really had a sort of a hot seat on both of these issues.
Susan Blackmore.
Well, I think that Stephen's done a very good job at knocking some prevalent ideas, and it's very easy for us to say, oh, well, I never believed that anyway. And I think you're absolutely right, Stephen. People won't overtly say, oh, yes, I believe in progress, but, you can watch them believing in it as a kind of subtext. However, where I really disagree with you is about your sharp distinction between biology and culture. I take rather almost the exactly opposite view. You've done a wonderful job at undermining our belief in there being some real progress towards a goal in biology. I think we need to do the same job for culture. You said that we have unleashed this thing on the world. Well, I'd take it more in a kind of evolutionary way. I think culture does evolve. I think it evolves in a very similar way to natural selection. The ideas themselves, the memes, as Dawkins called them, are doing the driving, and we are just the passive recipients of all these ideas. And we have the arrogance to think that we've unleashed this culture, that we've created these things, and this is real progress. I rather take a much more undermining view, still another step in undermining the centrality of humans, right, by saying that the ideas are doing it and not us.
We'll get to it later. I think memes are a meaningless metaphor, and the ideas have no independent existence from the mind.
Stephen Fry.
Yeah, I enjoyed the book. I think it's witty and wonderfully argued, and I love the wide range of reference, which is very typical of Professor Gould, and I thought it was a delightful book. And as I say, I was shocked, really. I mean, I thought I was more or less an educated fellow who sort of understood Darwin, and I wouldn't be able to write a very convincing essay on it, because I haven't read Darwin like most people. And so, I'm the typical shameless inheritor of the morphic resonance that is Darwin, and therefore I'm very, very ill-equipped to talk about it. But it's a delightful book. And, obviously, we progress in some ways technologically, as Stephen has said. The Model T Ford hasn't continued to evolve independently. It's been replaced by modern Sierras and Mondeas and Fords and so on, and we cannot but transfer the image of our progress of the Model T to the modern motor car to the protozoic life forms in the soup, turning into the creature that we are now. This point in time, this now, we regard as evolution's final statement until tomorrow, which will be that everything has been leading up to now, because time travels in that way. We assume evolution travels towards a purpose, because otherwise, as Stephen said, how do we make sense of our lives?
Why is it that certain, in this cultural evolution of the last 100,000 years, with the same size brain moving forward so very, very quickly, why is it that certain parts of us have gone forward so very quickly and other parts haven't? Why has our technological side, just to make it simple, our technological side advanced so speedily, which everybody can see, and as you say in the penultimate page of your book, the creative side seems to have, in a way, well, certainly not advanced, and perhaps stood still and even now and then regressed. What's been happening there?
Technology is simple. It's just applied. I don't mean the individual problems are easy, but it's just applied physics, and it was slow to build up, and there's still a lot of room for it to go forward. When you get into creativity, since the mind itself hasn't changed, I think the problem is that when Whitehead said that all philosophy was a footnote to Plato, it didn't mean there weren't smart people afterwards, but the first great thinker is able to specify all the great problems. The first great cave painter can do a representational animal with all the beauty, and it doesn't mean there isn't room later on, but I think that since the mind hasn't changed, when you get to creative artistic activities, you can fill up a potential space much quicker than the progress of physical invention.
But if the mind hasn't changed, the mind has changed in knowing more and more about physics.
Oh, there's more knowledge.
So, well, that's a change, isn't it? I mean, Archimedes knew more than people before
I meant it hasn't changed.
And we have built an Archimedes. So in that, well, just a second. Sorry to interrupt, but so we don't cross each other. So the mind has changed in that way. Why hasn't it changed in the other way? I'm just curious.
The mind has changed in terms of knowing more, but it hasn't changed in its neurological structure. I think its modes of reasoning. And there are some things that, unfortunately, we're very bad at, which probably have an evolutionary legacy. We're terrible at reasoning about probability, for example.
Do you buy Jane's view of the human consciousness using whatever is available as its metaphor, in that thing about the origin of consciousness that he wrote?
I thought that was an interesting book, but it was, as you say, metaphor, and he explicitly so identified it.
Right, let's turn to Dr. Sachs's journeys around the world for the next few minutes. You're going to the island of the colourblind in this week's programme, the Pacific island of Pingalap, where 1 in 12 of the inhabitants are colourblind. Can you tell us what you're trying to demonstrate in this series, where you're visiting people in different parts of the world who have these... well, people might refer to them as disabilities, disadvantages. Some people have said that it's been slightly rather like a bit like a freak show going around. What are you trying to tell us in all these visits?
Well, first I want to say that my complementary mode of expression is a book. And the fullest expression of what I want to say is in my book on the island of the colourblind and not in the programmes.
Yeah, but we're going on the programmes.
But in particular, to sort of tie this up with what we've been talking about, certainly I am not interested in disability as such. What I'm interested in is the resourcefulness, is the way in which this may challenge a person and a community, and the resources which may emerge in consequence of it. So that, for example, deaf people who may have difficulty speaking and who cannot use their ears may develop a visual language and a visual culture of great complexity built on this. And here, in a way, on a different biological basis, you have an entirely new culture developing. What I've been especially interested in recently is to look not just at individual patients, but at communities where there's an unusually high instance of colour blindness, of Tourette syndrome, of deafness, of anything else. And basically to see how the communities respond and, I want to say evolve, except we're not allowed to use that word.
Yes, you are.
Right. So, for example, here on the little island of... now, there's a fascinating story of H.G. Wells, which I read in my boyhood, and many people may have read, called The Country of the Blind. where a benighted traveller blunders into a lost valley in South America and finds this village of people who lost their sight through a disease 300 years before, and have also lost the very idea, the very concept of seeing in a visual world. But their other senses and sensibilities have changed immensely, and they have adapted to the world, and they have adapted a world to themselves, so they are then sort of culturally complete and successful. When I heard of this island of the colorblind in the Pacific, I wondered to what extent it might be a sort of Wellesian island of this sort. And so I've been particularly interested in how the colorblind people identify the plants, which they do perfectly well. They don't use color, they use other things. And the way in which they're adept at night fishing, and the way in which they have found a place in the society. So, and in that place, to use a rather cliche term, which is used in America, they are not disabled, but they are differently abled.
Yes, I didn't get enough information from the program, to be honest. Maybe, for instance, we see them doing night fishing, but I didn't know what they were seeing that we were not seeing. I didn't get enough examples. You say they could differentiate between plants and that. What we saw was this extremely pleasant and very interesting Norwegian man, Knut Nordby, with you, saying this was darker centre, perhaps it was red. There was a lot of perhaps it was red, perhaps it was green. So I was lacking in information. I was also lacking, which I would have expected in a way, for some notion of what might be, because it's all very well to say differently able, but I bet they would like to see properly. I would like to know what sort of cure would have been in order.
Of course, I asked all the people, would you like to see colour? As I asked Knut. And the first answer is, your question is meaningless. I don't know what you're talking about. I can't imagine what I've never experienced. Then Knut will, for example, say, something like this cannot be added on. He said, I have grown up without any perception or concept of colour, and I've learned to do things in other ways. He says, if you gave me colour now, it would be an irrelevance. It might invade me.
I mean, it might not invade a child aged, just born, for whom there could be a cure.
Oh, no, I agree there, but it's similar, and I wrote about this in a previous book. If someone is born blind and you then give them sight in middle life, they don't know what to do with it because their brain has never learned to see. Now, one of the things Stephen was saying is that as a species, our brains haven't changed, but our brains are crucially dependent on our experience. And if one is born blind or colorblind, one has a different sort of brain, and what would be the visual or the color parts of the brain have perhaps been reallocated to other uses, and this is one of my themes.
Brenda, Maddox.
Well, I must say, I too was very confused. I mean, my reaction was, watching this with respect, so what? What are you trying to tell? Were you out there to describe how they behave? People can adapt to anything. We know that. Are you there as an anthropologist saying this is the way social organization takes place when people are deprived of something they want? Are you there as a healer, as a cure? Are you collecting research on these people? Well, otherwise, it is, I didn't use, Melvyn used the word freak show, but just fancy that. Look how different they are from us.
One of the reasons I went there was to observe and describe, and if you want to call that anthropology, fine. I also took along with me a load of visual devices because these people cannot stand bright light and have the poor visual acuity. I wanted to sort of, again, go partly to reassure them of the relative benignness of their condition, because this is a congenital condition. It doesn't get worse. It's not associated with, with anything bad. Possibly to talk a little bit about the genetics of the condition, and also to give them some visual aids, such as Knut Nordby has, which would really allow them to do anything. So I went partly as a physician, if you want, and partly as a naturalist or anthropologist.
I mean, did you leave that little girl who was trying to read, and then she was given the magnifying glass. I mean, did you leave a lot of magnifying glasses behind? I mean, were you there in the sense that this is one of those vanishing islands? Pretty soon everybody's going to come in, give them all magnifying glasses, and then we won't be able to study it.
Well, we left 200 magnifying glasses there. You know, how well they have survived and quite what is happening
How many
now,
fires have started?
No, I don't know. And we actually took 700 pairs of dark glasses so that all the colour normal people could also have dark glasses, so they wouldn't snatch them off the faces of the colourblind. But I'm not quite sure what is meant by the term freak show. I find it both offensive and unintelligible, and perhaps you would tell me.
Well,
what's-
let me just say this.
Yes.
Did you ever think of, as you look at these variations on the human condition, of studying people who are exceptionally gifted, unusually musical, or something, rather than people who have these really conspicuous afflictions?
Of course. Well, you know, I have done this, and I'm doing this all the while, and I think what especially interests me is the conjunction of affliction and giftedness, such as one may see, for example,
Sounds like
many,
God's plan.
In many people with autism, which is one of the subjects.
Yes, I mean, Dr. Sachs prefaced all this by saying that what he has to say is mostly said in his book. So I think, and I mean, it seems to me a television program about colourblind people is interesting in its own, that you expect to see so much more in it. I'm not surprised you find it offensive and unintelligible as a comment, because I think it's fascinating in its own right. It's a result of incest, is that right? That this whatever it is, recessive gene has become permanently ensconced in the population?
Well, certainly very close into marriage. There was a typhoon which decimated the population on Pingalap 2 centuries ago. It got the population down to about 15 people, most of whom were related to the royal family.
It's rather ironic that the name of the island is so similar to the Latin from which we get our word pigment, is it not? Painting,
Yes,
pingo,
right.
pingery, pinksy, pinksy.
That's right. and they sort of heroically, and as you say, somewhat incestuously repopulated the island, and this started to emerge then in the third generation afterwards. I mean, one always sees, well, one can also see sort of odd gifts become concentrated and dispersed in this sort of valley. I would have liked to have visited and filmed and written about a valley of absolute pitch in Hawaii. Wow. And there are, you know, isolates may concentrate disability, they may concentrate ability as well.
That's a form of memory, isn't it, though, perfect pitch? I mean, essentially, you only know what a C is a C if you've heard a C, and some people can remember and some people can't. Is that right?
Right.
Stephen Gould.
And it's no great advantage.
Intervals are easier.
Yeah, I mean, as a lifelong choral singer, where choruses sometimes go flat and a cappella singing, I'd much rather be able to sing intervals accurately, which I can, than to have absolute pitch, which I don't think correlates with musical genius in any sense. No,
Right.
but the main thing I'd say is that, no, I too object to such terms as freak show, and I think coming out of the theme of my own book in this sense, I think Oliver and I are united. All of this is just an expression of the enormous variety in the species Homo sapiens. Naturalists are interested in it. I happen to have a son who's autistic. He also happens to be one of the best day-date calculators in the United States. Do I not wish with all my heart that he will like the rest of us? Of course I do. Is he not a complete human being with some wonderful skills? Of course he is. I mean, it is variety that characterizes the chief theme of my book, whose American title, Full House, is more expressive of it, is that we have to consider variable systems as the ultimate reality in nature. The reality of Homo sapiens is not some platonic abstraction of average or normal humanity. Homo sapiens is its variety and nothing else. It's all of us and all of our multifariousness. That's Homo sapiens, nothing else. That's what Darwin tried to teach us deeper than anything else, that it is the variety of variable systems that constitutes reality, not some platonic abstraction.
You know, since religion has come up, I'm reminded of how I visited a Mennonite community in Canada where there's a very high instance of Tourette syndrome, where the people have these violent convulsive movements and ejaculations. And this actually was seen by the religious community as an example of the divine versatility. And they had a blessing which is rather like the Jewish blessing to be said on seeing the strange, where you praise God for the diversity of creation. Nothing to do with a freak show, nothing to do with disability, diversity.
Susan Blackmore, how would you define memes and how would they fit in? Well, before we see how they fit into what we've been saying, you're doing this lecture on memes. Can you tell listeners who haven't encountered memes what they are?
I expect more listeners have encountered them than remember. I expect a lot of them have read Richard Dawkins' 20-year-old book now, The Selfish Gene, in which he really popularized the idea in biology that evolution doesn't proceed for the good of the species or even the good of the individual, but it's all driven by the selfish replicators, the genes, which are kind of fighting it out. And it's that selfish fight between those replicators which gives rise to all this biological diversity we've talked about. Now, at the very end of his book, you know, the few pages at the end of every great book where people say, oh, they go nutty and have a bonkers idea, his bonkers idea was that of the meme. He said that genes are not the only replicator on our planet. There is also another replicator working by similar means, and this is the meme. These are instructions stored in brains and passed on from brain to brain by imitation. So just as genes are instructions for making proteins stored in the cell, in DNA, so memes are instructions for producing behavior stored in brains. And we pick them up through our lifetime and we pass them on. And you could say that just as our bodies are a creation of the genes, a conglomerate got together with lots of genes producing a complicated body, so our minds are a conglomerate of all the memes that this brain has picked up in its lifetime. And I find that very, very useful idea. And I'm trying to make it work in all sorts of ways. Just how far I'll succeed, I don't know.
What's
we'll
different?
See.
How does it add to what we already know about how the brain works? What's different about it? What does it make? How does it make us think of the brain and ourselves differently?
There are two questions there, one about brains and one about selves. In terms of brains, it makes us see the brain as a kind of an open powerhouse ready to be infested with memes, ready to be taken in any direction according to the culture in which it's embedded, and the fantastic mechanics, the neural networks, the whole structure of the brain is like ready to be taken over by these things and can end up producing radically different people. The implication for ourselves, I think, is more frightening and extends what Stephen Jay Gould has been saying about really, Darwin's essential insight that, we are not in charge here. We're not so important. We're not the ultimate end point, which is to see that rather than seeing myself as a kind of little person inside in here, somebody in charge, someone who consciously makes the decisions and runs the show, we have to turn it on its head and see myself as a construction of the memes that's come about through the selfish fighting between all these ideas that are around in the culture. The ones that have happened to succeed getting into my brain have constructed this idea of a self, a story, if you like, an illusion of a self in charge. That turns on our head, I think, for all of us, our idea of who we are and our place in the world.
But isn't that a sort of redressing of Hartley's theory of affinities or the Lockean tabula rasa or any other view of how the mind is this space to be invaded, as you put it?
No, because it's not a tabula rasa. There are lots of things that sociobiology is finding out more and more about the kinds of the way brain structure makes us able to do some things and not able to do others. I mean, Stephen Jay Gould in his book has highlighted our absolute hopelessness with certain probabilistic concepts. We are really bad at very simple probabilistic questions. That's just the way our brains are. So we don't start with a tabula rasa. We start with a biological brain that's very good at certain things and does or doesn't have colour vision, does or doesn't have tendencies towards liking certain things, being attracted to certain men or women or whatever it is. We start with all that. And then we add this new replicator that comes along and starts fighting it out in that complicated context.
Are you constructing a very elaborate metaphor? I mean, genes, as I understand them, there are experts around this table, are real things, measurable things, quantifiable things. Memes is a way, as a concept, it's a way of looking at inherited bits of wisdom. And actually then to say they reproduce, which is actually an organic function, even for bacteria, is misleading. You've already taken us into the path of Never Never Land, really, or poetry, or just look at it this way, but it's not real.
If it's an elaborate metaphor, and if people will show me that that's all it is, then I'll give it up. I'm not after an elaborate metaphor.
That's what astrologists and people would say. I mean,
then it's no good, and you're absolutely right. And I'll come back in a few years' time if I can't make definite scientific predictions from this and do experiments that will show that it's a better way of looking at the world, then it's a failure. I don't want an elaborate analogy. I want to make the idea work. Now, if you take that point, well, we can see the DNA. We know what a gene is, and we don't know what a meme is. Fair point. On the other hand, evolutionary theory went a very long way between 1859 and the grand synthesis early this century, when we finally realized that DNA was what was doing the driving of evolution. I think we're at the moment in 1996 in the same state in psychology. We can see the general process happening. We don't know how it's done in detail. I think we will in the future. But I don't think we need to solve that problem first. I think we can look at the general process and make some predictions. I mean, let me give you one simple example.
Everybody wants to jump in, but
Yes.
let me just ask you for this before everybody does jump in. What do you do if you want to change your memes? If we're just an amalgam of all the nuggets of things, supposing you find yourself depressed, in difficulties, one thing or another, you actually want to do something about it. What can you do with this inherited, reproductive, selfish lot of ideas rattling around in your head?
Who's the you? You see, on this view, you are not separate from the memes. There's not a magic you in there to do
somebody
this.
who can make a telephone call and say to someone, I need some help.
Now, you see, this is the power of this idea, and this is why I was invited to a Buddhist conference and to give this
I want to
lecture
hear
because
about that, but we may yes.
well, because one of the essences of Buddhist philosophy is that it's an illusion if you think there's somebody in there who's really, a conscious self making conscious decisions. On this meme view, of course, you are a bunch of memes. So it's more a question of how can a shift be made given this person in this culture, not how can I, as a separate independent being, change it.
But can you
Jay
change? All right,
Sorry,
everybody.
Stephen
Yeah,
Jay Gould.
I think Brenda put her finger on exactly why the meme concept is bankrupt, and I don't think it's going to get very far. Although, try it by all means.
I will.
I don't believe it. I'm a First Amendment absolutist in U.S. terms. Pursue whatever you want, which though it may be.
Thank you.
But it's so central in science to distinguish between metaphor and mechanism. Metaphors
agree.
are not useless. The Gaia metaphor
I agree.
is a non-mechanistic statement that has some utility. To me, memes are nothing but a metaphor. And they're a metaphor based on a fundamentally false view of consciousness, and I think that's why it isn't going to work. You see, it's ultimate Western reductionism. To have a notion of the meme, you have to be able, as you can for genes because they're physical separable entities, though they have mixed consequences, you have to be able to cash out the notion of meme to divide the enormous complexity of human thinking into items that have a certain hardness, that have a certain transmissibility. But human thought is not that. It's not breakable up into tiny little hard units. Everything interpenetrates. The only thing memic analysis has ever been any good for are things like that are trivial, like changes in hairstyles and skirt lanes, because those are things. The other thing is you'll never be able to work a Darwinian metaphor because a Darwinian mechanism requires random variation. Memic variation is not random. There's no way on earth it's ever going to be. That's why every attempt, and memic thinking is not the first, there's a whole history of this. Every attempt at so-called evolutionary epistemology, that is to make a Darwinian evolutionary epistemology, has failed because you will never get the fundamental characteristics of the Darwinian mechanism, random variation and the natural selection of random variance. Mind directs its items, and there are no items. As soon as you have the impossibility of breaking down, it's hard enough for genes. That's why sociobiology failed, because my thumb length isn't a gene, and aggression isn't a gene, and homosexuality isn't a gene. There are complex genetic and environmental components. You can't do it for human thoughts. It won't work.
I disagree. I don't
know
know
you
that it'll
disagree.
work. I think it'll work. But you put your finger on an important point there. You say it's quite different. We don't have random variation and so on. Now, if you want to look at the whole process of natural selection working with a replicator, what you need is not, you need random mutations, variation, and you need selective pressures. We've got both those with memes. When I copy an idea from you, if I ask you to do something, here's Oliver Sacks doing his lovely Tourette jerks, which people can't see, but I can copy those and go, ooh, and now something has changed that I have copied that, but I haven't copied it exactly. There's variation.
Randomly with respect. In the same sense as if our brains are constrained
there's
by thinking
variation
badly about
and there's
probability,
selection.
There's no randomness in the variation.
I think we've got
And
all
you
we
said
need.
I here. I mean, you make this point for memes that are revolutionary because they make us look at the I. They've descented the subject of the human. But I mean,
Yeah.
Freud did that over 100 years ago. So,
Right,
as
we're
it were,
continuing this
and-
process.
Well, you're not. It's a completely different one. I mean, Freud wasn't talking in that way at all. And, of course, you can see why you and Dawkins offend a lot of people when Dawkins... I mean, I admire him and you greatly, of course. But, when they talk about religion as a thought virus or something.
Yes.
And free will... is a big issue, and the idea that we are a bundle of things that has no control. You say, I copied Oliver's gesture. Well, I mean, you're now falling for a metaphor that you say is useless. And what is the I?
What is the I? First, quickly, please. If you don't
Quickly,
mind.
in that context, the I is this body here. Clearly, this action
This
happens.
body?
Yes. What I'm not adding to it is a little self in there who's running the show, because I think that's our real problem. We still believe in little selves inside. Look in the brain, and what do you see?
Oliver
Loads of
Sacks.
neurons. You don't see a self.
Look in the brain. You can help us. Huh?
Though I agree with all that has been said about about names as metaphors not being useful in a Darwinian sense. It may be perhaps a useful concept with regard to some forms of what one might call neural knowledge or disposition. And I think there's some non-trivial examples of this. One of them, for example, has to do with grammar or syntax. If, for example, one has Chomsky has brought out the point that the child's nervous system in the 3rd or 4th year of life constructs grammar from what he calls the meager and degenerate data, which the child has not taught grammar. Now, with deaf children, if deaf children who have had no access to language are brought together, they only gesture and mime. But let a single deaf child with American or British Sign Language come in for an hour, and to use your term, they will be infested with grammar. And within a week, an idiosyncratic but grammatical form of sign language will have emerged among the whole group.
Because it's a universal, not a randomly varying.
Right, oh, sure.
Precisely because of Chomsky, because it is a pre-programmed idea in all humans.
Exactly. And since you mentioned tics, I'm reminded of a Scottish boy with Tourette's whom I spoke to. And I mentioned to him that I'd seen a boy in London with Tourette's who had ticking spitting. And the words were not out of my mouth before the boy in Scotland did this. And he said, I wish you hadn't mentioned this.
Oh, that's a wonderful example.
He said, you have now given me the tic. And he also then went on to say that he thought that spitting had been a latent tic, or as you would say, pre-programmed, but somehow now it had become manifest in the same way as grammar is in some sense latent and can become suddenly manifest. So in these rather peculiar examples, perhaps one might allow something like a meme.
I think it's a wonderful example because you put together the constraints given by the brain in the first place with the memes that come along later. That's the richness that I think we can get.
The word phoneme, of course, is used by linguists.
Stephen Jay Gould, final word, you wouldn't agree even with Oliver Sacks' examples in the sense of confirming what Susan Blackmore
It still won't work as Darwinian epistemology. Oliver is talking about universal properties of mental functioning. The variations among us are by no means random and will not work into a Darwinian system. No, I believe the brain is closer to what the phrenologist said in its division into multiple capacities. Even vowels and consonants score differently on the cerebral cortex. There's no Spearman's G in there, but that doesn't validate mimic theory either.
I only wish we were on television. Our listeners are being deprived of all these memes and body language. I've never seen so much around this table.
We're going back to culture with Stephen Fry, making history, rewriting history in your new novel, Stephen. The central plot deals with how a 20th century world might have been different if Hitler had never been born. The idea of moving backwards and forwards in time has fascinated a great number of writers. What fascinates you particularly about it? If I can speak of you. Well, or your memes. How did your memes get
I suppose two things. One, like a lot of people, like Oliver talking about his H.G. Wells story, I remember Raymond Bradbury's story about time travel, when someone goes, a paleontologist is investigating, and he comes back, and they're not allowed to interact on the theory that if you kick a stone a few million years in the past, when you come back, the future will be different. And he very carefully, in his sealed suit, examines these little prehistoric animals that he's interested in, and he comes back into his podule and he discovers there's a dead butterfly on the sole of his foot. And when he returns to his own time, the letter E is written in a different direction, and various other tiny changes that drive him mad. And I was fascinated by that idea very early on. And I suppose, like all Jewish children growing up, we all remember the day when our mothers tell us about the Holocaust and the sort of puzzlement and so on that grows with it. I mean, all human beings, of course, I dare say, remember when they first understand that awful period of our history. But there's no doubt that to Jews it means something that this cousin and that aunt and that uncle aren't alive because of it. And so it seems natural for all people to speculate, gosh, if we could go back in this story, a historian who specializes in Hitler's very early childhood in Brunau meets by accident a physicist who, and this is obviously the leap of fantasy that any book of this kind must take, is able to send a spermicidal pill into the water supply of Brunau in the early 1880s so that Alois Hitler is sterilized. And of course, the moment this happens, our hero wakes up in America and the history is very different, and at first he thinks it's wonderful because no one's heard of Hitler. And the premise I work on, I suppose, is, I think, a justifiable one, that perhaps Hitler was for the best, because he was mad, because he tried to invade Russia in the winter, because he didn't finish off England. The irony of the book, of course, is that the person who exemplified the torrent of anti-Semitism and Theurism and pan-Germanism of the Germany of the 1920s was more efficient, but he also had to play with, this extraordinary water from Brunei, with which he sterilized all the Jews of Europe so that he wiped them out entirely. So this fellow has to go back and make Hitler be born. That's the sort of paradox, that in order to save history, he has to undo what he's done. And I suppose it's also about the fact that we all demonize Hitler, perhaps, and let the rest of humanity off the hook a little.
Yes. I mean, this man Glode, who is the alternative Hitler,
Yes.
is charming, witty, and successful in ways that Hitler was not successful.
Well, he doesn't throw all the physicists out of Germany in the 30s, so that Germany has a nuclear bomb by 1936.
Then he
which
started
probably
bombing
easier.
everybody, right, bombs everybody right, left and centre, and you write a new history of the world, which is chilling in a way. So you're saying that you think that Germany, at the end of the 19th century, was so full of these notions, that had Hitler not been there, somebody else would have taken it in the same way. That's what's interesting.
Well, I don't know. Of course, I can't.
No,
know.
but you're
I mean,
saying it in
Hitler
your
didn't
book.
invent much. I mean, of course, he had his own particular skills.
He intensified a lot.
He intensified a lot, but,
Yeah.
but Goebbels was still around, Himmler was still around, Rosenberg, Streicher, all those people were still around. I think you would have just as much to prove to say if Hitler hadn't been born, none of that would have happened, that none of that hate, none of that extraordinary
fascinating,
nationalism
yeah.
would have focused into a coherent political party or into a military machine. I think it's an astonishing idea to say that just the birth of this one child in this one little village in Upper Austria caused the entire thing. And I agree that, I mean, I can't prove what I'm saying. It's merely it is a novel, and it's an idea, that's all. A meme. It's a thought virus that
very
I've released
complex
on the
meme.
world. Yes, I mean, I don't make any great claims, but,
No, but it's fascinating.
I think
Maddox.
people are bound to be.
Yes, I was. Were you suggesting? I mean, I couldn't. I mean, I'd love to know what you think apart from this very ambitious novel. Do you think history might have been otherwise? Did it depend on this individual, or were the social forces so great that anybody would have triggered them off?
I have a feeling that a lot of Jews would have been killed. I mean, the book Hitler's Winning Executioners, for example, which shows, and it's been shown before, I mean, a huge number of the massacres in the early part, before the final solution, or the Wannsee Conference, were committed by Ukrainians and Latvians and Lithuanians, while Germans looked on, rather perplexed, not knowing what to do. That the so-called liberated countries of the Balkans and so on, I mean the Baltic, the anti-communist forces just rounded up all the Jews and beat them to death in the town squares, while German soldiers looked on amazed. That's in the 30s. That's, as I say, it's not to take anything away from what happened, but I doubt, that the Jews would have lived happily and peacefully in Europe for the next 100 years just because Hitler hadn't been born. But I don't know.
One of the things I took from your book, which I found very useful, and it wasn't the historical exercise, what if? It's kind of the idea of all of us have Jewishness in ourselves that made one want to come to terms with one's own concept of Jewishness, in the sense that Sylvia Plath said, I think I must be a Jew. The sense that everybody, Jew and non-Jew, feels some sense of guilt at not having participated or having escaped it all. And what is your own responsibility? And would have you rather been more Jewish, less Jewish? How would you have played it? And I thought the book nicely brought in that ambivalence. But you did have people who are both Jewish and not Jewish.
Yes, well, because that's how I felt myself, because my father's not Jewish at all, but my mother is, which is supposedly the bit that counts, as they say. On the other hand, I went to an English public school and I don't look very Jewish. I'm much taller than most Jews. I can pass as non-Jewish, if that means anything. But nonetheless, it's Hitler who would decide that I would be rounded up. So in the sense of if there's anti-Semitism around, I would suffer from it. I might as well, therefore, be proud of it as well. And I found, I think as a lot of people do who are half Jewish, that as I get older, I find it more important. In my teenage, I wasn't that interested in it. In the 20s, I wasn't, because my family was never religiously Jewish in any way, so I never kind of did the Seder nights or anything. But I have done since, and I'm rather pleased to be Jewish and rather delighted by it. I don't know why, I just am. I suppose it's because I love being different, I don't know.
Stephen Jay Gould, what about these time switches and this, had Hitler not been born, there would have been a similar...
Oh, I love the literature of contingency, because I think the history of life works that way also. If a tiny little creature called Pikaia, the first chordate member of our phylum, hadn't lived, all of vertebrate history would have been wiped out of the record, and you'd have just a sensible history, but with no conscious scribe to record it on this planet. So I think in fact, history of life works that way, and the notion of contingency is far broader. I love contingency novels. Harris's Fatherland is the obvious other one about Hitler, where, in fact, Germany wins the war, and at Hitler's 75th birthday, the world's very different. We have a President Kennedy, but it's appeasing Jack Kennedy's father, Joe, who made that kind of peace with Hitler. But you see, I guess my view here is a little darker, because I so much believe in that, oh yes, anti-Semitism was endemic, and there were certain aspects of German society that made it more vicious there than in Italy, but I think if Hitler had been executed after the beer hall putsch in the 1920s, when his movement was small and marginal, you never would have had that degree of organization that would have led to the Holocaust. History would have been enormously different in its details, but those details mattered to us. Those details are 6 million Jews dead. There was no one else who had the capacity of demagoguery and organization. Goebbels never could have done it. There never would have been a movement like that without this one man. I don't think individual men make history. Men make history, but they do not make it just as they please. No one likes to quote Marx anymore. Failed in many ways, but that one line is marvelous. The way it begins the 18th Brumaire. Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. And I think fundamentally that's right.
Oliver Sang.
I also love contingency novels.
Yeah.
I haven't read yours, Stephen, but I'm going to read it tonight.
Oh, no, you've got far
Yes, do.
But and as I've been listening, I've been writing if all over a piece of paper. When we did chemistry at school many years ago, there was an English chemist called Mayau, and it was said if Mayau had not died prematurely in the 1670s, he would have discovered oxygen a century before Lavoisier, and the history of chemistry and of technology and of the planet would have been different. But whether it would, it's a question of, as you were saying, Stephen, of how much is the culture and the cultural movement and the political movements invariant, how important are individuals. Supposing Darwin hadn't been there, would there have been someone else? There's a delightful, interesting science fiction novel, because computers were in principle possible. A century, Babbage was making
difference engine. Then.
In the 1830s, and supposing computers had entered then. I'm not sure whether these are real interesting questions, but they're wonderful for the imagination.
Well, that if you've just picked up is the heart of it, isn't it? And I love this comparison between the biological and evolutionary question and this novel question. How much would it be the same? Stephen Jay Gould is well known for being far out on the sort of contingency, that the littlest thing can make a huge difference. And yet there are constraints in biology. You have to see that within a planet bathed in light, getting eyes that can see is a really good idea.
It takes us a lot of getting used to the fact that, because physicists as well as biologists tell us that the contingencies on which the existence of the Earth and its atmosphere are based are so extraordinarily, billion to one shot, that it makes people think, therefore, there must be an order behind it. But the fact is, we wouldn't be here to know that it was, were those conditions not prevalent.
That's right.
Actually meaningless. It's a meaningless fallacy, exactly.
And yet, given those things, this kind of creature is very likely to appear, and we have. And that's why I liked the things that stayed the same. You still had cars, although they were different, and you still had computers, although they were called pads. So I enjoyed that tension in there very much.
Well, thank you very much. Stephen Fry's book, Gold Making History. Novel is Gold Making History. Susan Blackmore is giving a lecture at the LSE on memes, minds and selves on the 28th of October.
November,
I'm sorry. Oliver Sacks's BBC series is accompanied by a book. Stephen Jay Gould's book, Life's Grandeur.